Hi, welcome to my video series on how to solve a quadratic equation. We're going to look at the first part, which is maybe the easiest of the ways, and that is to solve a quadratic by factoring. So let's go ahead and go over to the whiteboard and I'll show you some examples here. So here we are over at the whiteboard. We're going to solve quadratic equations by factoring. So this is only going to work if you know how to factor. If you have trouble factoring, I really suggest you look at my other video that goes in depth on how to factor anything that's a quadratic, especially if you have a hard time. So take a look at that. My emphasis here won't be so much showing you how to factor as how to use factoring to solve the quadratic equations. So let's go ahead and look at a problem. So let's look at x squared minus 7x minus 8 equals 0. There's just a couple of things you need to keep straight. One of those is that if you want to solve a quadratic equation, it must equal 0. That's the only way we're going to be able to solve them. I purposely set these up to be set equal to 0 to start with. Okay, so now we're going to do this by factoring. So I'm going to do this the way I showed in my other video. You may have another way of factoring, and that's fine. I'm just going to go through my way. So I would put a 1 here. I'm going to do first times last. 1 times negative 8 gives me negative 8. So it's got to multiply to be negative 8. But it's got to add to be that middle term of negative 7. So my combinations are 1 times 8, 2 times 4. The middle is negative, and so the bigger number needs to be negative here. 1 plus negative 8 gives me negative 7. That's going to be my combination. So I'm going to go x squared plus x plus negative 8x minus 8 equals 0. Divided down the middle, I'll factor out an x. That leaves me x plus 1. And on the other side, I'll factor out a negative 8. And that will leave me with x plus 1. Now, if you do that step right, you should have the same thing in both parentheses, which I do. So I'll get x plus 1 times x plus 8, negative 8, equals 0. Now, could you write this as x minus 8? Absolutely, it doesn't make any difference. So now we have our factored form. That's your first mission, is just to get it factored. Just to get it factored, let me back up here and get that spelled right for you. You want to get it factored, which we have. Once you get it factored, now you got to think, two things are being multiplied to be 0. So just as an example to show you as an aside, if I had 2 times something and I wanted it to equal 0, what would I have to multiply 2 by? Well, I'd have to multiply by 0, wouldn't I, to get 0 out? What if, as another example, I had something times negative 1/3 has to equal 0? Well, still, wouldn't it have to be 0 times negative 1/3 to be 0? In fact, the only way you could ever get two things to multiply to be 0 is if one of them is 0. And so how you solve this from here is you set both the parentheses equal to 0 because you don't know which one it is. So both the things we factored will be set to 0. And then from here, you'll just solve it. So I'll subtract 1 and get x equals negative 1. And then over here, x plus negative 8, I'll add 8 to both sides. And that will give me x equals 8. So notice I got two answers here. So either x is negative 1 or x is 8. And that would be my final answer. Now, these also have, this is the answer, but they also have another name. They could be called roots. That's another way that you hear about them a lot. They also could be called zeros. And they're called zeros because look how we set it up. When we set it up, we let everything equal 0, and that's always going to be true on quadratics. So those are just another couple terms. So basically, you just factor the side of it and then set the parts to 0. That's really all this method does. So let's look at another problem just to show you a couple other extra examples. So, okay, x squared minus 64 equals 0. So on this one, I'm going to factor it. I know these are two perfect squares, so I'm going to factor them. I know that they have to be identical inside, so they both have to have x. 64 to be identical would have to be 8 and 8. And there is no middle term, so one has to be plus and one has to be minus. Okay? If that doesn't make sense to you, go back, look at my factoring the other way, and you can get to it. So now I have it factored. What do I do next? I set the parts to 0. X plus 8 equals 0, and x minus 8 equals 0. Then I solve it off. I'll subtract 8 over here and get x equals negative 8. And on this one, I'll add 8. So be careful on these and get x equals 8. So I don't get the same answer. One's negative 8 and one's positive 8. Pretty simple. Once you get the idea that you're just going to factor and set the parts to 0. Okay, let's go on. Now this one, again, you've got to factor it. So, gosh, when I see a perfect square down here, I always try that first. So I'm going to go ahead and try my method of making both parentheses the same. If I made this a 7 and a 7, and to get an x squared, I need an x and an x. Everything's positive there. And then I'm just going to double check to see if that would give me 14. That gives me 7x. That gives me 7x. That gives me 14x. So that's a pretty quick way to do it. Okay, so now I'm going to set the parts to 0 now that it's factored. X plus 7 equals 0, or x plus 7 equals 0. So notice both equations are the same. So when I go to solve them and subtract 7, I'll get x equals negative 7 over here, right? But if I go negative 7 over here, well, I get the exact same answer. So there is no reason to write that twice. When you get the same answer, just write it once. Okay, so my answer will be x equals negative 7. If you get the same answer and it shows up twice like this, it's also called a double root. Why double? Because they're exactly the same answer. Okay, so pretty straightforward on that one. Let's try the next one. All right, this one I put in here because there is a number in front. So now this scares me a little bit. So I'm going to go back to my first way of factoring. I'm going to multiply 12 times negative 5, and that will give me negative 60. So I'm going to go, what multiplies to give me negative 60? I'll go 1 times 60, 2 times 30, 3 times 20, 4 times 15, 5 times 12, 6 times 10, 7 doesn't go in, 8 does not go in, so that should be all my factors. My middle term is positive, so I'm going to make the smaller numbers negative. And then they've got to add to be that middle term of 28 here. So negative 1 plus 60 would give me 59. That's no good. Negative 2 plus 30 gives me 28. That's no good. Negative 3 plus 20 gives me 17. That's no good. Negative 4 plus 15 gives me 11. Ooh, this isn't looking good, guys. Negative 5 plus 12 gives me 7. That doesn't work. And negative 6 plus 10 gives me 4. Well, gosh. None of those gave me 28x, which means you cannot factor this. So, for the purpose of this video, if you're trying to solve something by factoring, you would say this is prime. And you can't factor it. Now, it turns out there is an answer to this, but you can't get it by factoring. So you have to stay tuned to the other videos when I'll show you how you could solve this one. But if your teacher asks you to solve this by factoring, you would have to say you can't factor it, and therefore you couldn't solve it by factoring. Tricky, I know, but you got to be used to the tricks too. Let's look at the last one. Now let's see on this one. Okay, I'm going to do my same method here. So 4 times 20, 4 times 5 is 20. So it's got to multiply to give me 20, but it's got to add to be negative 16. So 1 times 20, 2 times 10, 4 times 5. None of those are going to give me 16 again. So again, this one I cannot factor. So you cannot solve by this method. I would say I cannot solve by this method. The good news is there are methods to let you solve this. You can solve every quadratic. Every quadratic can be solved, but not all of them can be solved by factoring. So I'm going to write that down because that's like very important. Every quadratic equation can be solved, but not all of them by factoring. Not all of the equations by factoring. Okay, which means you are going to have to learn other methods. And I'm going to be showing you those other methods in part 2 and part 3 of this series. So for right now, you're just learning how to factor to be able to solve it. Okay, and that's simply factoring. Factoring to solve a quadratic. And thank you for watching.